Hi folks, David Jamieson here, editor of Conter.co.uk, and I'm joined today by a very esteemed guest, Leslie Huckfield, former Labour MP, former MEP. He was one of the founders of the Socialist Campaign Group. He's now a lecturer at Glasgow Caledonian University in business management, and someone who's been active in politics on the left since the 1960s, and who I think therefore brings a lot of that kind of veteran caliber to the contemporary political scene. Someone who's got a long memory of the twists and turns of British politics. First of all, thanks very much for joining me, Leslie.
Well, thanks for asking. Thanks for asking.
I wanted to bring that wisdom to bear on the contemporary political situation in Scotland, because I think for many of us who don't really remember politics before devolution, I mean, one of my earliest political memories is being taken to see the opening of the Scottish Parliament. I think we struggle to gain a sense of the enormity of what's happening in Scottish politics right now. The devolution project that opens those 22 or 21 years ago seems to be under incredible strain in two ways. One, of course, is that there's unprecedented support for ending the Union and therefore ending that devolved settlement. On the other hand, the current battle within the SNP and more broadly across the independence movement seems to me to be placing, and the Salmond Sturgeon controversy in particular seems to be placing the institutions of devolution under enormous strain. First of all, let me ask you about the inquiry in the Scottish Parliament. I mean, do you agree with me? And before we started this recording, we actually talked about an article that I urge people to read by Alistair Bonington in the Scottish Legal Review. Do you agree with me that this inquiry seems to be exposing the failures, the limitations of the present devolution settlement, and undermining perhaps even the self-confidence of Scotland's democratic institutions?
David, again, thanks for asking. Let me try not to do too much all our yesterdays, but I think I can claim to have been absolutely consistent on Scottish independence. I actually came to Scotland during the 1970s, before we got to the meaningful referendum on independence. And I was doing meetings on independence then. So I think I can say that I've been absolutely consistent throughout, and I'm still very insistent on Scottish independence, which for me comes in front of a heck of a lot of other stuff. Okay, to answer your question, I've always been concerned, apart from the very centralized nature of the SNP, I've always been concerned that there wasn't enough accountability structures in the Scottish democratic process as a whole. Let me just say a tiny word about this before I get on to the inquiry. There obviously isn't a House of Lords in Scotland. I'm obviously very glad about that. But even the way in which the Scottish Parliament does its committee hearings, the stages of its bills and stuff like that, I don't think that process is properly equipped to give the kind of scrutiny that a nation like Scotland ought to have. So even aside from the sort of present issue of the inquiry, I don't think the Scottish Parliament has enough powers, and I don't think it's set itself up properly. On the actual inquiry itself, I'm actually quite amazed about the fact that the Lord Advocate can turn up to a Scottish Parliament inquiry, and don't forget he's a member of the cabinet. I mean, he's got the rank of a cabinet secretary, and he actually can turn up to a Scottish Parliament inquiry and say, well, actually, you don't really have those powers. And secondly, if you do try and ask for information, that's against the law, because that's what basically he was saying. Now, you know, and I know that the evidence that they really don't want to publish, first of all, it's the Scottish government's evidence which they sought. So there isn't any difficulty in the Scottish government, and indeed the Lord Advocate, if he wants to say, well, okay, you can see that evidence. Now, that shows to me, and I recognise that the Lord Advocate is a member of the Cabinet, and that's the same in the UK as well, obviously, because the Attorney General is a member of the Cabinet in the UK as well. So that's not a unique position, but it is a unique position when the Lord Advocate turns up to a Scottish Parliament inquiry and seems to be speaking like a Cabinet Secretary rather than the Lord Advocate. Scotland's got its own independent judicial system, which is different from the UK. And his first role, his first duty ought to be to uphold the independence of that judicial process and that judicial machinery, rather than speaking as a member of the cabinet. But to come along and to tell a Scottish parliamentary inquiry, which ought to have the powers to do these things, that first of all, you're not going to get the evidence, and even if you ask for it, it's against the law to ask for it. I find the whole of that quite honestly incredible. But to just go one stage further, it's unfortunately the case that there seems to be a whole series of inquiries, like COVID in care homes and the fact that people were discharged from hospitals and put into care homes. It seems to me that one of the Scottish government's favourite recipes for losing things in the long grass is to say, okay, well, we'll have a parliamentary inquiry. And quite honestly, as soon as we have a parliamentary inquiry, as the present one is showing, either they aren't really serious in the first place because they don't have any legal advice as a parliamentary committee. I mean, I would have thought that if we're going to get into legal matters, there ought to be legal advice available to that Scottish parliamentary committee, which doesn't seem to be the case. So what we've really got is a Scottish parliamentary inquiry which doesn't seem to be equipped in the first place to get to the truth. A Scottish Parliament inquiry which, as far as I can see, only meets on Tuesday afternoons occasionally, and a Scottish Parliament inquiry which a member of the cabinet can turn up, neglecting the fact that he's supposed to be the chief judicial officer in Scotland, and to tell that parliamentary inquiry, I'm sorry, you don't have the powers to ask for that. I find the whole of that quite honestly incredible. It's symptomatic of a much bigger malaise, but I think it's a very good example of that malaise.
I agree, but I also think, and that's before you even get to the behaviour of the various parties involved in the inquiry. I don't think anyone at this point can deny that, for example, the Scottish Government's approach to it seems to be to, string the inquiry along until perhaps an election victory cuts short the entire situation and gives the Scottish Government a significant new buffer of perhaps a parliamentary majority. I mean, evidence from various sides has not been forthcoming to this inquiry that looks variously, rather silly, a bit toothless. And this is a very big case. I mean, this will be presumably the most remembered Scottish parliamentary inquiry. You're right to say, of course, that Scottish politics tends to bury sensitive issues in this way. Perhaps something that they've learned from the British state. The British state famously launches insider inquiries, which typically seek to balance public anger against protecting powerful elements in civil society. Now, perhaps that's a much more widespread practice actually than just Britain. But in any case, a lot of that does seem to go on in Scotland. But I think if people involved think that this won't leave a stain on Scottish public life, they're kidding themselves, because of the enormity of the issues at stake, because of the scale of the political actors who are under investigation, and so on. So it's been a real farce to observe. Go on, sorry.
If I can just say this, David, it's not just a matter of kicking it into the long grass or delaying it until after the May election or whatever. I mean, there's field after field after field of long grass into which I think this can be kicked. But the irony is that everybody knows what's been happening. Everybody knows what's been happening. You've only got to read Craig Murray's affidavit in his case. Again, if you don't want to read all of that, you've only got to have a look at the interview that Craig Murray did with Mark McNaught. Have a look at Craig's stuff. Have a look at some of the other comments which have been done. I think everybody knows, even without the inquiry, what's been going on. Now, obviously, if the inquiry were to come to the conclusion that the First Minister had misled Parliament, or if the inquiry were to come out with a conclusion along those lines, then obviously that would carry a lot more weight, because that then brings us to the decision of what happens to the First Minister, because once you breach the ministerial code, then you really are in serious difficulties. But even before getting to that stage, I have to say that despite any kind of explanation which the Scottish government wants to give, or any explanation which anybody in the media wants to give, I would like to think that you don't need much more than 2 bits worth of common sense just to read between the lines, and particularly having a look at Craig Murray's affidavit to know exactly what's been going on,
Well, this is an interesting point, because some people will sniff at that and say, well, it's a blog and so on, and I don't like Craig Murray. I don't know how many people know this, but Craig Murray's affidavit was actually used by Jackie Baillie, who of course is in the inquiry. It was sent out to journalists because no one was picking it up, and this is the kind of wider perspective on this, right? This is about the decline of, I think, a series of institutions, not just obviously the Scottish legal, there's a great deal of embarrassment in Scottish legal circles, as far as I can tell, under these circumstances. But it's also true that the Scottish media is by no means playing a full part in proceedings here. And I don't even want to, poke fun at journalists and so on who are working on this issue, because the real problem here is a lack of resources. The Scottish media has declined enormously in the last 10 or 15 years. And it's sad to see it struggle to come to terms with issues this big. And also, frankly, issues where, I don't know if you saw Andrew Neil, who's, of course, the chairman of The Spectator, and he set up this new TV channel and so on. And he's a figure on the right, it must be said. But he has said very openly, there's a very censorious attitude. There's a very censorious atmosphere in Scotland, and injunctions and so on are being thrown around all over the place. And we are going to, tear the lid off this. A bit of braggadocio from someone who likes to do that sort of thing. But it is clear. I mean, I've seen that in The Spectator now. They have actually published Alex Salmon's submission, which, hasn't been issued by the inquiry and so on. Now, it's come to something when a right-wing political journal based in London and blogs by people directly caught up in the affair have become the major sources of information, or at least major sources of information in a Scottish national affair of this kind. And it's quite sad, I think, to see Scotland's domestic media humbled by its years
David,
of decline.
But David, neither you or I should be surprised about that. I mean, most of the, I suppose that we can exempt the Herald, because basically that is still, I think, mostly in Scotland. I suppose we can exempt the Scotsman, because again, that is mostly in Scotland, but most of the other media that we have in Scotland are simply London offshoots. Many of them don't have proper Scottish correspondents. So in other words, they don't have the resource anyway. But of course, I obviously accept what you say. A lot of the newspapers that we still have in Scotland ought to be a lot better resourced. But I can go back a long way with Andrew Neil. My first wife used to be a BBC producer, and various BBC programmes used to play cricket. And I was in the same cricket team as Andrew Neil. So, I mean, I can go back a long way with Andrew, so I know where he comes from. But don't forget, Andrew is also a unionist. Andrew is also a unionist. So just as it's interesting that The Spectator finds it fit to publish stuff which they've picked up from Alex Salmon, if you have a look at some of the stuff which Katie Balls is now doing in The Independent and The Spectator, Katie is now starting to pick up the same line. I mean, Katie's thing in The Independent the other day, for example, was saying, don't regard Scottish independence as a foregone conclusion. I think we're going to get a lot of this stuff from Brillo. I think we're going to get a lot of this stuff from Katie. God forbid if Spectator TV ever really takes off, and even worse than that, if Murdoch TV takes off, we're going to get that all the time. So I'm not surprised at that. But as you quite rightly say, Scottish media, including the BBC in Scotland, very seriously under-resourced and very seriously not doing what they are supposed to do. But again, I'm sure we would both agree, that's just symptomatic of the very worrying, much more worrying lack of democratic accountability that we have in Scotland. I'll say this, and I hope I won't be too provocative. I think, quite honestly, in Scotland, there was more democratic accountability in 1706 than there is now.
That is a bold assertion. Why do you think that?
If you have a look at the balance of powers that you had before the Act of Union, obviously we had various King Jameses on the throne, but we had controllers of supply. We'd got the justices of the peace. We've got the lairds. Now, I'm not saying that all of those were democratically elected, because they weren't, but at least they were a sort of counterbalance to the king. And at least the king had to be a bit careful what he was doing. Obviously, the whole thing got very serious because of the Darien scheme, and that's why we had the Act of Union. But at least there was a balance of forces. At least there was some kind of devolution of power. It now seems to have got to the stage. That because the SNP is a model of democratic centralism, because the Labour Party is falling apart before our eyes, and hopefully because the Tories are about to disappear, we really don't have even the basic modicum or means of democratic accountability in Scotland. And what worries me, that's bad enough as it is now, but to try and erect the whole structure that we have to have, the whole institutional framework that we need for independence, on top of that serious lack of democratic accountability, I think is very worrying indeed, very worrying.
Yeah, and of course we didn't have the popular franchise in the 1700s, but I still take your point. I mean, it's a strange thing for me to, for socialists to have to look at Scottish politics and say, where are the liberal institutions? Where's the balance of the accountability, the separation of powers, all that stuff that you tend to take for granted in a modern kind of parliamentary state. But I think I agree with you. This is a much more general malaise. So you have a series of middle class institutions in crisis. I mean, this affair has also, of course, brought the civil service itself into a degree of question. Then there's the legal establishment, and then there's the media, and so on outward in concentric circles. And I have to say, I'm fascinated on a sociological basis what's happened to the Scottish kind of liberal middle classes, because was a time when institutions came under this kind of pressure from, as you say, an extremely centralized political regime, that it would be the kind of liberal intelligentsia who would be up in arms and defending their institutions and shouting about constitutional concerns and democratic concerns and so on. And that seems to have regressed. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon is very much a favourite of those sort of social layers. So we're in a very odd situation in regards to that.
If you go back to the Thatcher days, obviously the Scottish liberal elite didn't pick up Thatcherism, but what united Scotland above all against Thatcher wasn't just the anti-poll tax campaigns and stuff like that, in which a lot of us were involved. But what really united Scotland is that the middle classes in Scotland, Scotland's liberal elite, were very concerned about the levels of unemployment which they could see that Thatcherism was causing. We'd been through Upper Clyde shipbuilders, we'd been through Ravenscraig, we'd been through all of the stuff that was happening in Scotland in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and Scotland's liberal elite came together. And some people call it Scottish culture. I'm not so sure it was that. I think it was Scotland's liberal elite coming together and basically saying, we really can't take much more of that now. You quite rightly say that largely seems to be absent. And one of the reasons, of course, that it's largely absent is that there are large sections of Scottish liberal elite who were actually doing quite well out of the status quo. It's a very nice place to be. You can be a member of parliament and you needn't sort of say very much. I mean, there's one or two members of parliament, for example, one of which I won't name here, but actually runs a Sunday afternoon London-based talk radio show. There's other examples that I can give you of Scottish SNP members who I can't understand what the heck they're doing. But what I can say, generally speaking, and I'm talking about the legal profession, I'm talking about a lot of people in public office, the present situation for them is very convenient, and they're doing quite nicely. They're doing quite nicely. A very good example of that, and we both know where Charlotte Street Partners is coming from, and we know where Charlotte Street Partners would like to get to. The Financial Times, Saturday, January the 30th, an article setting out the case for a timetable for independence. Who does it come from? Doesn't come from Michael Russell, doesn't come from Nicola Sturgeon, certainly doesn't come from the Labour Party. It comes from Andrew Wilson. What on earth is the founder of Charlotte Street Partners doing, writing anything on behalf of Scotland in the Financial Times?
Yeah, absolutely. It is an interesting mutation, and without lionising the kind of Scottish kind of, there's this kind of paternalistic, bourgeoisie who've dominated Scottish public life for so long. It is a strange mutation that has turned them into this very, very conformist social element. You hear a lot about the retreat of a kind of formal working class politics from public life and how the working class has changed and so on. You hear less about how much the middle class has changed in relation to these things. The liberal political tradition across swathes of the Western world, this isn't just a Scottish condition, seems to have taken a very kind of oddly authoritarian turn. And I think this is another expression of that. And I think people should know as well that what a lot of people are now seeing with this inquiry, many people who have had the opportunity have seen this for much longer. So in the last 5.5 years of working as a journalist, it's become completely apparent to me. I mean, we talk about the ministerial code and whether or not Nicola Sturgeon has violated it. But most journalists recognise that the ministerial code hit the waste paper basket years ago, because there are meeting after meeting after meeting over the last 5 years, and I'm sure longer, I've just not been working that long in that field, where there are meetings are completely unminuted, nothing's ever written down, no advice to the Scottish Government is written down. I don't know how many people know this, but for the opening months...
But of course, David, they don't. And to a certain extent, if the Scottish general public is misled into thinking that this is simply a battle between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, to some extent, it's actually convenient to a lot of other people if people only regard it as that. What's actually happening to me is the same sort of thing that happened in Spain after the fall of the dictatorship. And, we had Juan Carlos coming into the Spanish parliament and basically said, we're not going to have the army taking over again. Pablo González and the PSOE in Spain became the government. And a lot of people in Spain, it really clicked. They thought, well, half a minute, this is going to be the government for the next 10, 15 years. If we play our cards rightly, there's going to be some good positions around. We can get public service positions, we can become ambassadors, provided that we keep in with the PSOE. And a lot of those people, by the way, joined the PSOE, became members of the so-called Spanish socialists. A lot of that now is happening with the SNP as well. There must be a number of what we used to have in Scotland, chief constables. We've now got a unified service, but there used to be a lot of people in prominent positions in Scottish public life, local authority chief executives. They used to be in the police, they probably still are in the NHS, who have worked it out that what you need to do is to make sure that you've got a good relationship with the SNP and you'll be okay. You'll be okay. And because they can see independence on the horizon, There's going to be a lot of ambassadorships coming up. I mean, we're going to need an ambassador to Washington, an ambassador to the United Nations, and all the other bits and pieces. There's a heck of a lot of Scotland's liberal elite at the moment. First of all, they find the present situation very comfortable, and they reckon that all you've got to do is to keep in with what Charlotte Street partners are saying, and not to get too much distance between you and the SNP and the Scottish government. You do all of that and you'll be okay. You do all of that and you'll be okay. And a lot of people, quite honestly, will have worked that out. They would have worked that out.
I can tell you, I mean, me and some of the people in the radical independence campaign, back in the day, you used to kind of play a game where you would point at people in the independence movement, people of our age or younger even, and say, you could point at people and say, they're into this for the politics. And then you could point at the person next to them and say, they're into this for a job. They're into this because they're climbing a ladder, which is is an inevitable part of human society. I mean, it's what politics has largely become, of course, across huge swathes of the democratic world. It's just another industry full of professionals. But on that point of the failure of the Scottish government to record events, I mean, it really is extreme. So in the opening weeks and months of the pandemic, the Scottish government received no written advice from the chief medical officer or from any medical official. They received no written advice on how to deal with the pandemic, or how to introduce a lockdown or anything like that. That is a totally bizarre state of affairs. And again, its ramifications upon wider elements of civic life should be concerning. No one can ever write a history book with that information in it on how Scotland dealt with the pandemic. No journalist can inquire further than that into how decisions were made, and they turned out to be catastrophic decisions about how to deal with the pandemic.
But David, if I may say so, and I'm not belittling you and I'm not belittling your contribution, but I mean, is it any wonder that that happens when you have a look at the structure of the SNP? We've got a situation, if you have a look at the past 3 or 4 years, we've had the report of the Growth Commission, and the Growth Commission is basically, North British neoliberalism. We had the Higgins report, and the Higgins report is a sort of watered down version of stuff that I used to be writing in Merseyside in the 1980s. We've just had, and again, you have to sort of get your head around it because it's so insignificant. We've just had the Scottish Renewal Advisory Board. And the Scottish Renewal Advisory Board, it's all things to all people. People have got to be nice to each other. People have got to be a bit more equal. We've got to make sure that people have got enough food. We've got to, it's all of this stuff about, you can work it out the same as I can. Empowerment, community participation. I mean, the stuff that used to be churning around in England and in Scotland for the past 20, 30 years. But that's all we've got now. Now, I haven't seen a single SNP MP, let alone Labour MP, bearing in mind we've had the Growth Commission, we've had the Higgins thing, and then we've got this Scottish Renewal Advisory Board. I haven't seen any serious political questioning of that at all within the SNP. I haven't seen any serious questioning of the fact that the Growth Commission is austerity plus plus, apart from sterlingisation, apart from people have noted, I presume, that the Growth Commission has reported, apart from the fact that the Higgins people have reported, and now we've got this Renewal Advisory Board. I don't think we will get any real debate about those, which are all very significant conclusions. And they are big things, and they are Scottish government things. They were set up by the Scottish government to produce reports. And of course, we're not going to get any serious questioning within the SNP on any of that. First of all, because the SNP is so disciplined that we've still got a situation in the SNP where constituencies aren't really allowed to choose their own candidates. Constituency parties aren't really allowed to choose their own constituency party officers. It isn't going to be the National Executive Committee of the Scottish National Party which will write the manifesto. We've got a situation in the SNP where, quite honestly, if you've got any politics about you, And particularly if you look as though you might be capable of any kind of independent thought, you can forget all possibility about becoming a constituency party officer, but most of all, you can forget any possibility of becoming a candidate. That's the level of control now we've got in the SNP. And it's because of that. It's because of that that you're not going to get any serious questions asked about the Growth Commission, the Higgins Report, and this Renewal Advisory Board. The thing that we had out yesterday, the so-called report into adult social care, that didn't start off as a report into adult social care. That started out as a commitment by the First Minister to set up an inquiry into a national care service. National care service. And a lot of us were hopeful that we'd be talking about taking care homes into public ownership and stuff like that. What is it about? It's about we've got to increase the personal care allowance a bit more. We've got to increase the nursing care allowance a bit more. And it's all watered down stuff like that. But I'll make you a little bet. There won't be a single SNP MP who asks any fundamental questions about that. And if they do, they will be told, wait until after the election.
Yeah, I mean, there are some people in the SNP who are very critical of the Growth Commission, but I take your point. It's in terms of the sort of MPs and the MSPs, it's exceptionally thin on the ground. It was very interesting to see Alex Salmond in his submission, which has, which we're not supposed to see, but we're going to see anyway. If we read the Spectator, I think it was there. He said he kind of blames himself for what's happening to him because the SNP was over-centralised under his watch. And so he is the author of from his point of view, of what has subsequently happened. But I think that was an interesting, whether or not he's right about that's what's, brought him into this position. It is an interesting admission of the structure, of the way in which the SNP was built. And the few people who have followed closely the development of the internal culture of the SNP over the decades will all testify to that it was built almost like, as you say, like a model of democratic centralism, or even a distortion of democratic centralism, because it was less democratic. I mean, it really was, Salmond was at the heart of the organ over so many decades, making ultimate decisions. Nicola Sturgeon was very much his protege in that role. And when she took over, if anything, the democratic circle in the SNP shriveled down even tighter into a tiny circle of people centred around Nicola Sturgeon and Peter Murrell, who we found out during this investigation never talked to each other, apparently. I mean, this is the other thing. The excuses being made in public and the claims being made in public about the way this country is run are completely unbelievable. But I wanted to ask you one last kind of main point, which is you mentioned earlier that people like Andrew Neil are circling this entire situation. What I'm starting to worry at this point, and you know what, this criticism of the devolution settlement and where it's arrived to with this hegemonic party and this extremely powerful leader who has escaped so much accountability, this doesn't come from a place of wanting to do down Scottish politics or whatever. This comes from a place of, this is why we need Scottish independence. It's one of the reasons why we need Scottish independence, because this state of affairs is undemocratic and it's untenable and is clearly prone to mutations, authoritarian mutations. So, but my worry at this point, and it must be the worry of a lot more people, is that Boris Johnson and kind of unionist intellectuals and outriders like Andrew Neil must be circling this situation thinking, we can develop a case here that the SNP has grossly undermined Scottish democracy, and the British state has a fundamental responsibility to stop those deformations from happening. Leave aside for the moment that Boris Johnson has no right to talk to anyone about democracy and good governance and all that kind of stuff. Like I'm talking about in terms of an attack line. They have one teed up here, and it could have serious consequences for how we resolve the Scottish national question.
I'm not so sure that they worked all of that out. What they have worked out, and this is the sort of Katie Balls in the Spectator stuff and in the Independent as well, what they have worked out is that there is a struggle between sturgeon and salmon that they can exploit. They've worked that out. They've worked that out. But whether they have worked out the extent of the democratic deficit, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, to all intents and purposes, and unless many of them have been really involved in politics, they won't really understand the significance of what I'm saying. Whether they understand the size of the democratic deficit that we've got in Scotland, whether they understand the acute centralisation of the SNP and the way it's run, I'm not so sure. Because in many cases, they won't have examples or comparisons that they can make. I mean, I gave you the example of Pablo González and the PSOE in Spain. But there's also the example of the Labour Party, you see, in the 1980s. I mean, in 1983, we got to the stage where, well, I was a member of the National Executive Committee. It was the NEC that wrote the manifesto. It was the National Executive, and okay, we were in opposition then, but it was the National Executive Committee that wrote the manifesto. But after that, because there were a lot of complaints about that, in that Kinnock Charles Clarke era, all of the sort of powers of constituency parties to choose things and do things and send resolutions to conference, a lot of the internal democracy of the Labour Party was removed during the 1980s. I think that Peter Morrell has built on that. But to go back to your question, I'm not so sure that there is enough understanding of that in Scotland. Brillo, Andrew Neil, will understand a bit about the fact that you've got big government in Scotland. He understands that because don't forget he was with the Scotsman. So Brillo will understand that. Certainly the sort of Scottish political commentariat are not picking up very much of it. And a lot of the London-based journalists are not really picking up very much of it because they don't understand the political processes anyway. What most of them are picking up, and this is what the Craig Murray stuff is doing, is to portray this as a battle between sturgeon versus salmon. I'm not so sure that they're picking up the rest of it. What they will try and say is that there's a lot of stuff in the SNP which is not harmonious. Don't conclude that everybody in Scotland wants the same thing. I think it's going to be quite difficult for a lot of them to put together an argument to say we can save democracy in Scotland. And the reason that I say that is that I don't think they fully understand the lack of democracy that we've currently got in Scotland.
Well, Leslie, that was a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed that. Thanks very much. And I hope we can get you back on as things develop, because there's a way, there's a bit of this still to run, obviously, and discuss the situation and what the response, from the left should be. So thanks very much for that.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thanks. And you can go to conter.co.uk to see a much wider discussion of the political moment in Scotland. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like this. You can also subscribe to our ConterCast podcast on SoundCloud. And hear much more about all these issues as the controversy in Scottish politics continues to unwind. And I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.